Hi everyone, welcome back to Young and Wifed Up. This is Marcella.
And I'm Gabby.
And thanks for joining us this week for another episode.
If you would like to support the podcast for free, we would love if you can get on your podcasting platform that you are listening on and give us a rate and review. And if you would love to join our community online, we have a free online community through our Facebook group, which is also called Young and Wifed Up. I have the link in the show notes. And as well, if you would like to support us financially, we would love if you would become a monthly patron. We love our patrons. They keep us going. We appreciate you ladies so much, each and every one of you, even if you've only subbed for 1 month or if you've been subbing for several years. We appreciate you guys so much. And one of the things that we did on our Patreon account recently, a few months ago, while we were on, I think, a little bit of a break before this season, in between season 6 and 7, we did a interactive book club where Marcella and I read through all the chapters with you guys, and Marcella and I took turns giving audio commentary, talking about the chapters, fleshing out the themes, talking about all the ways that we related to the March family and all the ways that we can apply the virtues to our lives, and also just the incredible literary themes. I think it's a timeless book. It's definitely worth a read if you haven't read it already. And if you'd love to read it with us, you still can. All of the Little Women book club material is still on our Patreon for every single tier. So if you would like to take the plunge and read this book for the very first time, or even with fresh eyes, this is a great time to do it, because today we're actually going to be talking about the March family and the different themes that we think we can apply as homemakers, specifically from each character to our lives. One thing that I thought that was fun, even though it was difficult as well, is Marcella and I both had took so many different things from the chapters as we listened to each other's commentary, because we weren't recording together, we were recording separately. It's interesting how we both took so much out of it, but in so many different ways, because of our personalities, because of the way that we read books and the way that we intake books, and also because of the stages of life that we're in. So one thing that I made it difficult, which I mentioned, is that Marcella and I never really got to just like sit and chat together about the March family and talk about all the things that we loved about these women, these incredible characters created by Louisa May Alcott. And I thought that this was a great opportunity for Marcella and I to just divulge together and chat together about the different things that we appreciated and took from each character, and actually give some applications. So you guys are getting kind of a first look of Marcella and I talking about it together and getting a chance to kind of review some of the bigger overarching themes of the book. But again, if you want detailed analysis of each chapter, head over to our Patreon and you can find all of that material there. So Marcella, I'm going to have you get started on our first character, which is Marmee. And I know Marmee is a very precious character to you, as she is to me, but I think even more to you in this stage in your life, as you are a mother of young children. And there are so many things that I know you probably took from her character this time reading it than you did before when you were younger. So go ahead and start for us.
Oh yeah. So with Marmee's character, in the context of like homemaking, where her strength lies is really in her ability to create an environment of love and wisdom and care. I mean, there's like there's a theme in the whole book. She really is the anchor of the March household. She's, providing emotional support and guidance to her daughters. She's teaching them the importance of things like self-sacrifice and love and resilience, often leading by example, especially, with her own husband being away for a time and having to do things herself. And then all the things that come up, later on in the book, then having young adult daughters and the things that, the challenges that come with being a mother to that age group as well. And Marmie's strength as a mother is really rooted in her ability to impart moral and spiritual lessons. And that nurtures not only their physical needs, but also their characters as well. And she really does help her daughters navigate challenges with compassion and a lot of practical advice. And yeah, I definitely read or noticed things differently with Marmee reading it this time than when I first read it when I was a kid, because Marmee was kind of like more of a, not like a background character, but she wasn't like a main character in my eyes. Like, it was more like, well, the girls are like the main characters, and in a sense, yes, they are. But I feel like what makes them the main characters, it has a lot to do with Marmee, and you don't really see that until, maybe you're older and like reading it with fresh eyes. And so I think some pointers that we can take from Marmee is um even if you don't have children, I think there is an aspect of being maternal, not only to your own kids, but also to those who are even, younger than you, that you take into your house, that maybe you show hospitality to, um, younger adults, teenagers, even if you have mom friends that, their children. Um, and not even just like providing for like the physical hospitality, but also, you know, what I mentioned before, the emotional support and guidance too. So even like sort of like that spiritual maternal um position as well, and really garnering that, and also obviously being wise and loving. And it's interesting because there are, like, from what I remember from the book, the things that stuck out is that, like, Marmee was such a character to look up to, as far as, like, she was truly, like, gentle and had a lot of integrity and was diligent, about so many things. But there were instances throughout the book where she would admit her own faults,
Mm,
because her daughters would kind of put her up on this pedestal and be like, "How can you do this so well?" And she's like,
mhm,
"No, you don't understand, like, I need the Lord's help, and, like, I'm not perfect at doing these things." So not just, like, leading by example, but also showing, like, I do also have my weaknesses, even though you see the strong side of me, and I take care, to show that side to you. That doesn't mean that it's always come this easy. And, once you read the book, you like definitely see those situations happen, and that, like, her admitting or like confessing where she falls short, it doesn't she does it in a way, and I think because of how she handles herself outside of those things, um it really, it doesn't make you lose respect for her by any
mhm,
means. And I think it does the opposite,
mhm,
because you do see, okay, wow, it is hard for her, but she is still trying, and she is still, like, able to get through it, and she's figured out a way, or, she's come up with her own things that help her with, her anger, or with, her frustration, or like things like that, having to do with um the day in day out of homemaking and being a mother and wife and all that. So I think there are like so many pointers to take from Marmee just throughout the whole book, but I think those are like pretty encompassing, is like her being very maternal and wise and loving are um are good things to focus on, especially um, at this age and stage of our lives,
Yeah, I
and go on
I
to.
definitely appreciated, especially like in her interactions with her older teenage and young adult daughters, like you were expressing that she did show her humanity in a lot of ways, but it was still very appropriate. Like she wasn't like wearing her heart on
Mhm,
her sleeve and doing this like over and above transparency where she's like kind of towing the line between the mother-daughter relationship. It was still very appropriate, and it was being used as a teaching moment for her daughters, especially I think one interaction that you're
mhm,
kind of speaking to is her interactions with Joe, where Joe is talking about, "Oh, I just have such a quick tongue. Why can I not bridle my tongue, and why am I allowing my passions to get away from me? I'm indulging in anger and rage." And she's expressing to her mother like, I feel alone. I feel like, why can't I be like you? Why can't I be like self-controlled like you? And that's when she kind of lets down some of, her guard, and she kind of shows humility, like you said, and shows her a side of her that maybe she hasn't seen before. And that kind of goes to
mhm,
show of like this just appropriateness of like she didn't it's not like this over and above transparency where it would be inappropriate for her young daughter to see her disrespect her husband or interact with others in a way that's lacks self-control, but that she has learned to be so self-controlled that even her own daughter is shocked when she hears, "Oh, you struggle with these things?" Like, I had no idea, because
mhm,
she herself is control of herself. She has, and she talks about how she asks God for help, and that she even asks her husband for help, like help to help keep her accountable. And I think that she's a great example, even though this is a character that Louisa May Alcott made. All of these characters that she made have so many layers and so much depth. It feels so real. Like these are real people, because the
mhm,
author, she just has such a way with making these characters so human and real and so relatable, and but still something to look at and aspire to and be like, I want to be like Marmee. I that's good storytelling, man. That is living stories, living books. It's not this like forced, how to be like Marmee. It's like you see Marmee live her life throughout the book and you're like, wow, I want to be like her. And that is incredible storytelling. Do you have any other thoughts
mhm.
on Marmee before we move on to Meg?
No, we can move on.
Cool. Okay, so it's interesting. You guys will hear if you guys have listened to or will listen to the Little Women commentaries we did on Patreon. But I talk about, and so does Marcella, talk about in length like who we related to at certain stages of our life when we read this book and how it's changed now. And one of those things for me in particular is I feel like I identified a lot with Joe when I was younger, and now that I'm older and I reread the book, I really identified with a Meg in a lot of ways. And I do think one of those ways is being the older sister sort of thing. And I really related to her in that. But also just seeing, especially when she gets married and she's experiencing the highs and lows of being a wife and being a homemaker. I feel like I really relate to her because the book outlines so many of these incidents that she has where she is striving for domestic excellence and she wants to do well, but she has, she's human and she makes a bunch of mistakes. She has a lot of mishaps and how she kind of overcame them. So, as the older sister, Meg is definitely the most traditional and aspirational in her approach to homemaking. Her homemaking is highlighted in the book. So, she is, I think, one of the most traditional homemakers out of the four sisters. Um, After marrying John Brooke, she begins to face the realities of managing a household on a modest budget. And that's another thing that I thought was very sweet about her. She was very frugal and she was very content. And she definitely made much with the little that she had. And there's a specific incident in chapter 29 where she attempts to prepare jellies for a party, but they didn't turn out as expected. Now, in the beginning of her marriage, her and her husband were hosting a lot. They were hosting their friends a lot, and it was overwhelming her. And she was wanting to do a good job, wanting to make a good impression, especially as being the new home manager of her household. She did really want to put her best foot forward, but this is one of my favorite parts of this book, which before I would have said something completely different. But as a new full-time homemaker just in the last couple of years, I really felt like my heart just like went out to Meg hearing this story about her failing her jellies and how overwhelmed she was and how stressed she was and how patient and sweet her husband was through all of that. Despite this, Meg is driven by a desire to make her home beautiful and elegant, even though they don't have much. Her homemaking strength definitely is her determination to maintain a sense of beauty and order despite her limited resources. She learns to balance her ideals of beauty with the constraints of her new life and responsibilities. And a few things that I think we can apply from this character of Meg is diligence, resilience, and also being willing to be teachable and being willing to learn from your mistakes and to realize that like you're not going to do everything perfect the first time, and there is a learning curve to homemaking. There really is. And I think Meg is such a perfect archetype of the aspiring homemaker that just like is trying so hard to do well but is just struggling to maintain appearances. And I just feel like she's a very relatable character in that sense. And also I do appreciate that she does have a heart for her husband, even though they never ended up having much. Her sisters definitely probably got ahead of her as far as like income goes with their husbands. And she was like the poor, like the quote unquote, the poor sister, out of her other sisters that got
Mhm.
married. But I really appreciate her resourcefulness and her contentment and her attitude of like, I'm marrying my husband because I love him and not because of his status. And the era that Louisa May Alcott was writing in, this was a huge deal. So the historical context of this book is really important because the matters of marriage were so weighty because it didn't just reflect you, but it affected your like entire family unit. And so people were really worried because Meg was the first sister to marry. The other characters
Mhm.
were like, this is not going to be good for us. This is not going to be good for our reputation. This is not going to be good. People are going to think, we just let anybody get married to anybody. Even though the March family themselves were a modest family, they definitely had expectations for the kind of men that they wanted their daughters to marry. But do you have any thoughts on Meg?
Um, Not really anything additionally to what you just said. I also really like resonate with her whole the jelly won't gel situation.
It's my
Um,
favorite quote.
yeah, that's the best. And yeah, just like the experimentation and the what's the word that I'm looking for? Yeah, just like the ups and downs of the failures of homemaking and like having to figure things out and but this is how like that's just how you learn
Mhm,
is you have to fail sometimes to figure out the right way to do it, and it doesn't always work great the first time. And I do agree that she's like probably the most um traditional as far as like the
mhm,
homemaking goes, of like wanting to do a lot of those things herself. And I'm sure the income probably did play a part as well. So
mhm.
yeah, that's a good section there of the book.
Awesome.
really good.
Can you start us off with Joe?
Yeah, so Joe, I feel like her character strengths really come out in her being studious and more goal oriented. And this is pretty apparent throughout the book, and I feel like she really hones it in as she gets older, as the story goes on. Her strength is, like, definitely rooted in those 2 things. And though she's, like, obviously passionate about writing, as you'll if you haven't read the book, as you'll see once you get into it, it's, like, pretty apparent from the beginning, that's something she's very passionate about, and she, like, often gets lost in, like, her own literary world. She's also really deeply involved in managing the home, and I think that also comes along with because she is, like, one of the older sisters,
Mm-hmm.
um, so there isn't quite as much pressure as Meg has, um, but there is still a bit of that responsibility that you see that she carries. So she also like has kind of a feminist arc like in the beginning of the story. We really do see her character develop and mature as the story goes on. And especially as, you know, she moves away and she meets Mr. Meyer and all of that happens. And she ends up using her big dreams to eventually create her school for boys, which benefits the entire March family, including her own husband and children. And yeah, I feel like she could be an example of like mother culture using your gifts, your intellect to benefit your family. Excuse me. Um and also it was really encouraging for me personally to see how she grew in humility as the story went
Mm.
on and as she got older because I mean, like we were saying, she really does like have this like chip on her shoulder a little bit, like in the beginning when she's younger and like, you know, Marmy's trying to rein her in a little bit. Um, but then, you know, she grows up and, you know, she meets people and, you know, things happen and she like really does her character really develops just like so immensely by the end of the story and it all ends up tying in back to how even like those things that maybe we don't traditionally think as homemaking things like being studious and self-education and things like that, she really does use those things to the benefit of her home and family in the end, and not as like a sort of self-exalting aspiration. So I feel like she's like also really a really good example of that. Do you have any thoughts about her character?
Yes, I have many thoughts, but I'll keep it brief. I do think that it is notable that even when she was struggling with her feminist leanings, when she was younger, that she did use the money that she was making from her writings, even though her writings were garbage that she knew was garbage for a while. She was just using it to make some extra
Mhm.
money. But she used a lot of that money to help support her family, her other sisters, and her mom, especially when her dad was ill, and also specifically to do things for Beth, who we're going to talk about next. But I think it's really notable that with her, even though she had all these big dreams, and I'm going to be, you know, the man almost, and I'm going to climb these ladders, and I'm going to compete with men, and I'm going to do this and that. That she had such a heart for her family that those things shone through. And those are the things that carried on and into her later years, that her character was refined. She didn't lose those parts of her, but they were kind of like the weaknesses were smaller and then the strengths shown. And
Mhm.
also, I think it's very
Mhm.
interesting that she struggles with this dynamic of her wishing she was a boy, or her being like, I'm going to be the man of the house since dad's not here and I'm going to take care of business. And I think
Mhm.
Joe has it twisted in this way that she associated like her strong personality or her ability to kind of rally people together and lead people as a masculine strength. And that she's like, well, this is like a guy thing, or this is like a boy thing. And I just wish I was a boy and not a girl, because it's not appropriate for girls to be acting this way. And I think that if she was honing in on those things in appropriate ways that are still feminine and good for her, that she all those strengths, and she is able to use them in a feminine way later in her life. But it's so interesting that she points those things out as strictly masculine, and therefore she wishes she wasn't a girl, and she says things like, I have to be the man of the house, where it's like, you don't need to be a man to have like these strengths that can be appropriately used as a female. And so it's interesting that her character develops in such a way where a lot of those kind of um I wish I was a guy, or I'm going to compete with men sort of thing, that's sort of started fading away. And she was
Mhm.
able to refocus. And not only did she get married, have her own children, but she used these skills and these gifts that she had, like you said, to build this beautiful school that benefited her entire family, that her and her husband ran. And it's like this family business. And it's like, what a beautiful use, a very feminine use of her gifts, of her skills, of her strong character traits. And I think that
Mhm.
when we think about those things, it's like, are there ways where even we think, well, I used to do this, or I used to act like this because I was, being feminist, or I was competing with men? But there are ways, as we become more mature in the faith, or mature just as we grow up in experiences that we have, that there are strengths that we had that maybe were being used inappropriately in inappropriate ways for us to kind of get ahead, compete with men, or to usurp our husbands, things like that that were inappropriate. Those same things in their proper place can be used as a homemaker, as a wife, as a mother. Like those leadership skills, those strong personality traits can be directed in an appropriate way. And of course, all with temperance, which is something that I, have been praying about for myself, and something that I struggle with, because I do have a stronger personality. I do struggle with having like a quick tongue, or with wanting to take charge or take control of things in a lot of areas in my life. And in one way, when I was teaching, those were good. That was a good character trait to have, to take charge, to be in control of a situation, to be able to communicate very clearly. But then I can use those same strengths for bad if I'm indulging myself in sin, or if I'm trying to control situation in a wrongful way to further my own agendas. So I think it just goes to show that you don't need to um, completely overhaul your personality and the natural things that God has inclined you to be feminine. Like it is, you can be feminine and have different personality traits, different gifts, different things that God has created you for. But it's what is the way that we are directing it towards? Or are we indulging ourselves in sin? Is it inappropriate the way that we're using those different personality and character traits? So I don't know. That's something I really think that Alcott does well in this, is she was able to show Joe didn't change. She was still Joe, but she matured. She became more
Mhm.
feminine. She trusted in the heart of a man, and she like let herself be taken care of by a man and loved by a man. And I think that changed her character in a way where she was more refined, and she wasn't like completely different, where it's like, this isn't Joe. Like, Joe's different now, you know?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Anyway, um, do you have any more thoughts on Joe before we move on to Beth?
No, we can move on.
Cool. Okay, so Beth, sadly, and again, these are all spoilers, so it's like, oops. Um,
I
just
know.
pause.
I was trying to be a little,
Vague.
yeah, a little vague.
Well,
You're just throwing it all out there, so oops.
yeah, read the book and then come back and listen to the rest. Because this is the biggest spoiler. So yeah, Beth dies, so she has to get married. It's really sad. I don't know why I'm laughing, because I was literally like crying in some of these chapters because it's so sad and so beautiful, because Beth is just such a precious character, but I'm laughing because it's like, it's definitely like the biggest spoiler and heartbreak of the book. But Beth, so she does not get married. She does have a little thing with another character, but it's basically like her own thing. And the
It's
other party is not
one-sided.
involved. Yeah.
It's unrequited.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not reciprocated. But Beth is definitely a great example of a gentle and quiet spirit. She has so much selflessness and tender care in her character. And I think that even though she did not end up becoming a homemaker, because she was not, she never had her own household, she didn't get married, but she did have a lot of these strengths that I think that we as homemakers and wives and mothers can absolutely benefit from. The first thing is she was definitely naturally inclined, completely opposite of her sister Jo, to be quiet and selfless in nature. She was very humble, very easy for her to be very humble. She is the sister who finds joy in serving others, often unnoticed. Beth's role in the home is not always front and center, but her gentle and loving care is vital to the family. She is always ready to help, whether it be tending to the sick, playing the piano to bring comfort, or simply providing a calm and peaceful atmosphere in the home. Her strength is her small, everyday tasks that create a loving environment and help the family feel cared for. And I want to highlight that she did not only just bless her own family with her gentle and quiet spirit and her selflessness in how she cared for them, but she also benefited another family that she took care of a lot with young children, and an older gentleman who was alone in the house, and he was benefited so much from her personality and her character strengths. And I think that the application that we could take from Beth's character as homemakers is definitely a heart for caring for others, especially those who are ill, those who need help, those that are not just ill physically, but are kind of worn down, which I think we see in that her interactions with, oh my goodness, now I can't remember his name, Mr. Lawrence. Goodness. Her interactions with Mr. Lawrence, he's not in most of the book, he's in good health, but he is kind of a sad, kind of like crotchety old man in some ways, especially in the beginning of the book. And she really softens him in a lot of ways with her personality and her ability to be tender. And I think that those are great quality traits to have as a woman, is to be selfless and tender in how we interact with others, and being willing to live a life of sacrifice for others. And I really love, especially her quiet resolve in death, that she was ready to die, and she was more concerned with how others were going to handle her death than her own worries about herself dying, because she had complete assurance and trust in her Lord. And it was her the last chapters of Beth's life in Little Women is so telling of her trust in God, and also just her love for her family, that she wasn't even concerned with her own death. In the beginning, when she realized that she was dying, she did, like any other person, struggle with, feeling worried and scared about what that would be like. But it really, you do see a lot of peace that she has at the end. And I think that I want to definitely emulate that kind of maturity, especially because she was so young in the book when she died, that I think it's a great example of someone who has complete confidence and trust in God that he's going to take care of them. And I don't know, I really do think, even though Beth does not end up becoming a wife or a mother, that her life was cut short. I think she has many, many traits that we should definitely consider emulating. And I think Alcott, again, like knocked it out of the park with these characters that have so much depth. Marcella, do you have any thoughts on Beth?
Yeah, I think we can like definitely take pointers from Beth's character as far as like striving to have a disposition of humility and gentleness like she does. Um and that it can really make a difference, I think, as we see with, like you were saying, with like Mr. Lawrence and how he's more rough around the edges and, has more walls up, but um her being tender really does soften him, and it really like softens everybody around her.
Mm-hmm.
And how she sets more of like a calming tone in the house, because the other three girls tend to be a little bit more, not frazzled, but just like more outspoken, um m- more of a tendency to nitpick or maybe like get into squabbles with each other. And
Mm-hmm.
Beth is very focused on the peace and unity of the family, taking care of others, making sure, everybody else is okay and that sort of thing. Um and yeah, and yeah, especially like you were saying, that chapter um when she's kind of like talking about how she's had to, when she's with Joe, and Joe's essentially in denial, like, stop talking like that, like you're not gonna die and all this stuff. And Beth's essentially like, no, it's fine. Like, I'm okay with it. And even
Mm-hmm.
like at first I wasn't, but now like I have this peace, um, about what's gonna happen to me, and I don't want you to worry and that sort of thing. And it's just like, wow, it is an extremely moving chapter.
Mm-hmm.
When Joe takes her to um on their little like vacation, because in a sense Joe already knows in the back of her mind that her sister is dying, and so she like wants this one last, trip with her, or in some last desperate attempt to like try to heal her or get her physically better. And then, obviously it doesn't end up working and she does end up passing away. So anyway, yeah, that's about all of the extra thoughts that I had about Beth. We can move on to Amy.
Cool.
Um, okay, so Amy is definitely the artiste of the family. And she embodies a lot of like creativity, femininity. She is more of like the wild one out of the four of
Oh.
them. She definitely embodies that baby of the
Mm-hmm.
family vibe. Um, so yeah, Amy is definitely like the most artistic, but almost also like refined of the March sisters. Like she is it in the more of the beginning in her earlier years, she is really caught up with like, she's a little bit vain, like, kind of caught up with, appearances and things like that. But she really does end up bringing beauty into the home through her artistic talents and attention to detail. So this is like kind of another example of something that you kind of, a character that has a predisposition for something, like an eye for beauty. You can kind of fall into, either ditch on either side of the road, which could be, well, it can turn into extreme vanity where you are so concerned about your outward appearances to where it's like you are very self-absorbed. Or it can turn into channeling it into, well, if I really do have an eye for what's beautiful, how can I make even my physical environment beautiful and
Mhm.
help others to figure out what that looks like as well. And that was through, her paintings, her sense of style. She really uses beauty to make the home a more inviting and elegant place. And over time, she definitely matures. She learns to balance her artistic sensibilities with practical homemaking needs, and she ultimately uses beauty to inspire peace and comfort in the home. And I think this is all like that can also go hand in hand. Like there are situations where there's like a hospitality thing going on, an event or something, a party happening, and sometimes they have to bring in the recruit, like a sister has to bring in the recruits of Amy's eye for
Mhm.
redecorating, or how can we make this more of an inviting atmosphere, an inviting environment. And yeah, she definitely has a love for feminine elegance, and that definitely becomes a lot more refined as she gets older later in the book. And outside of those things, I think that another thing that I really appreciated about Amy's character, is later on when Lori is kind of going off the rails,
Hmm.
and essentially being an idiot. Like he's just, doing all this dumb stuff, and she knows it. And they've at this point known each other for quite a few years. And so they're not strangers to each other. And she calls him to a higher standard, and she's not afraid to tell him, you know, where are your morals essentially, and you're so much better than this. And the way that she does it, it's like not in a it is a little bit ego crushing to Lori, because at that point Lori really does like admire her, but the way that she does it, she's like very firm about how she feels about what he's doing, um but not to the point where she offers like no hope to him at the
Mhm.
end, if that makes sense. So I appreciate when she like when the development of her character kind of turns into this thing between her and Lori, and her like calling him out essentially and calling him higher, to something better. Um, that he now takes it upon himself to like live up to not just her expectations, but his own expectations that he like didn't realize that he had. So that's like another aspect of Amy that I admired, like the as the years went on, you get further into the book and their relationships start to kind of start to like meld together slowly, and you're like, "Oh, okay, I see what's happening now. These people are going to end up with each other, or whatever it ends up being." And um yeah, that's I think she had a knack for, with Lori specifically, um, being able to like still be feminine in the
Mhm.
conversation while still being truthful and honest. And yeah, that's another part of the book that like always stands out to me about Amy specifically. So, you have any thoughts about Amy's character?
Yeah, I really like what you said about her relationship with Lori and that specific interaction, because I do think at that point, Lori was seeing her kind of in a new light, kind of already, because she was older. He was seeing her
Mhm.
kind of outside of their normal context with like the other sisters. He was kind of
Right.
like getting over his situation with Joe, and he was kind of seeing her in a new light. And I think because Amy carries herself with so much beauty in femininity that she knows she was able to kind of use her power a little bit. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Like, her female sensibilities, she was able to kind of
Yeah.
influence Lori
Influence.
in a good
Mhm.
way, in a positive way, where she
Mhm.
does end up becoming just this perfect helpmeet for him. That she was able
Yes,
to
yeah.
use her beauty, use her um the way that she's able to kind of be persuasive with her beauty and her femininity. She used it for good in that
Mhm.
situation, and it ends up that they were a perfect match for each other. And it's interesting, like, I remember reading this and like watching the adaptations when we were growing up, and me thinking Joe should have been with Lori. Like, this is crazy. Like, I don't get it. But as an adult reading it
Oh,
again,
yeah.
I'm just like, they're perfect for each other. They really are.
Yeah.
And it just makes so much
And
sense.
then
And
well, and then when Joe ends up with Mr. Byer, it's like there's no way her and
yeah,
Lori would have worked out. Like
no.
Mr. Byer is then like the perfect match for Joe. Yeah.
Yes, again, like, he was able to kind of come in and be, yeah, stability for Joe that she needed. She was able to be more feminine because he was very solid and masculine
Mhm.
himself.
Yeah, and
And
then
so,
Amy ended up being like the grounding
mhm,
um the grounding part for Lori that Mr. Byer was for Joe.
yeah,
That's why they wouldn't
so
have been good
fascinating.
together.
Yes, so fascinating. I just wish I could get in Alcott's head of like, how did you come up with this? Like, this is just, it is such a gift. Like, this kind of storytelling is so, like, I can't even fathom the amount of careful planning of your characters, and like, to orchestrate their relationships,
Mhm.
and even just like the foreshadowing of everything. Like, it's just so good. But
Yeah.
I do think again that, like, there's a point where Amy in the beginning, again, we see there how this happens with Joe's character, and we kind of see the same thing with Amy. That Amy, like you said, was indulging herself in a lot of these high society things. She was being very silly, flirty, very ridiculous, like, ridiculous. But
Mhm.
because she was attracted to beautiful things, to fine things, to feminine things, but she, one, was hanging out with other silly girls that were losers and that were not good for her. And then on top of that, she's young and she's struggling like we all did in those years. And she's able to use, again, the same attraction for beauty, femininity, finer things. And she was able to, as she matured, use those things for good. And beauty is a good thing. Femininity is a good thing. Like, liking and appreciating finer things is a positive thing. And I think we've gone so far from and I think things are changing now, because a few years ago, I think minimalism went way too far to where we now have bare walls, and we have no color in our life, no beauty. Like, and I think that things are changing now in a lot of ways, but I do think that we can take a lesson from Amy, that the appreciating things that are beautiful and creating beauty around us is a very feminine thing to do. And there's a way that you can do it that isn't over extravagant or silly or ridiculous. There's definitely a way that you
Mhm.
can. And I think Amy proves it,
Mhm.
especially in the beginning of her character, but that you can refine that and channel those things to beautify not just your home, but to use those gifts as a female to win others over in a way that is persuasive and beautiful, like how Amy was able to help Lori to be a better man because of how she was able to lift him up with her femininity. It's just really
Mhm.
interesting, a really interesting character to think over, and to understand like characters and people are not simple. They're not flat. They're not just like, but we do have like two sides of our personalities and the things that we are inclined to, the things that are natural for us. And I think the difference is the world says, be yourself, be who you are, and like be unapologetically you, the good, the bad, and ugly. And I think something that is more godly, more virtuous is to hone in the strengths that God has given you and to use those things for the good of your family, for the good of your household, for the good of your community, and put away those things that come with those with your personality that God's given you. Put away those things that don't benefit anyone around you and weighs you down as a person because you're struggling
Mhm.
with those temptations and those weaknesses. And I think the March sisters are a perfect example of kind of the conflict between the strengths and weaknesses of a character and personality and fighting for the
Mhm.
virtuous things and how growing up does naturally in a lot of ways do that. But I do think because both Marmee and her husband, who we also hear about, but not as much in the book. We do hear about him, but Marmee definitely is way more highlighted. They definitely, you can tell that they developed these women in a lot of ways through their character, and
Mhm.
that these young women, like we don't see the first 18 years of Meg's life, like we don't, you know? And so we assume based on all of the virtues that she has that there was a formation of character happening in the home, and that um the atmosphere of the home was definitely created by the parents, and that a lot of these things
Mhm.
become refined as you get older and you experience life, and there's new things happening around you, relationships with others, etc. So yeah, those are definitely my final thoughts on Amy. Do you have anything else to add on any of the March sisters before we wrap up?
Nope, I think we covered it all.
Okay, guys, I think that's going to be it for us today. Marcella and I are losing it. We had some technical difficulties at the end here. And I'm literally crying. So anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed our chat about the March family. Again, if you would love to read along the book with us, even though we spoiled most of the big bangers, you can head to patreon.com/youngandwifedup and listen to all of our audio commentaries as we go through the chapters. And we can't wait to talk to you guys next week. Peace out.
Bye.